"Get that crying baby out of here." The words didn't just land. They cracked through the room like a dropped glass in a cathedral, sharp enough to turn every head at once. Forks froze midair. Crystal glasses hovered inches from lips. Even the soft jazz drifting from the corner piano seemed to stumble, as if the entire restaurant had missed a beat. At the center of it all sat Richard Langston, a man worth over $3 billion, a man who had negotiated mergers across continents and silenced boardrooms with a single glance. And yet in this moment, none of that power mattered. Because in his arms, his 8-month-old son was screaming. Not fussing, not whining. Screaming with a raw, relentless force that cut through velvet walls and polished marble like it didn't belong in a place like this. Theo Langston's tiny fists were clenched, his face flushed red, his cries rising and falling in waves that no amount of wealth could quiet. Richard adjusted his cufflinks out of habit, a reflex from years of control, but his hands weren't steady. He tried everything, rocking him gently, whispering under his breath, offering a bottle, passing him briefly to his assistant, but nothing worked. The crying only grew louder, heavier, like pressure building in a sealed room. Around him, eyes shifted, some curious, some annoyed, some quietly judgmental. A woman in a silk dress leaned toward her companion, whispering behind a manicured hand. A man near the bar checked his watch with exaggerated impatience. No one said anything directly to Richard, but they didn't need to. The silence between the cries said enough. For the first time in years, Richard Langston felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Not pressure from a deal, not risk from a negotiation. Something smaller, sharper, helplessness. And just beyond the edge of his awareness, moving quietly between tables with a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, a young waitress watched everything. Amara Johnson didn't rush. She didn't react. She observed. Every movement, every failed attempt, every second the room tightened around a man who was used to owning it. Her uniform was simple, pressed clean. Her expression calm. But her eyes were focused, steady, reading a story no one else in that room knew how to see. Because this wasn't just a crying baby. And in a place where power usually spoke the loudest, something else was about to take its turn. Amara had learned a long time ago that chaos had patterns if you knew where to look, and right now, the entire room was reacting to the sound, but no one was listening to what the sound meant. Theo's cries were not random. They came in sharp bursts, then paused just long enough to pull in air, then rose again, higher, tighter, like something inside him was building pressure he did not understand how to release. Amara slowed her steps, her tray still balanced in one hand, her gaze narrowing slightly as she watched the baby's fingers curl and uncurl, his back arched just a little with each breath. She had seen this before. Not in a place like this, not under chandeliers worth more than her yearly rent, but in smaller rooms, quieter ones, where children cried for reasons adults often missed. Richard shifted in his seat again, forcing a tight smile at the table across from him. The kind of smile that tried to pretend everything was under control even when it clearly was not. "He is just tired," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, bouncing Theo gently in his arms. But the motion was off, slightly too fast, slightly too tense, like he was trying to solve a problem instead of soothe a child. Theo's cries only sharpened in response. A server near the bar hesitated, glancing toward the manager, unsure whether to intervene or stay invisible. No one moved. No one wanted to be the one to step into a billionaire's moment of failure. Amara exhaled slowly. There was a rule in places like this. Do not interrupt. Do not assume. Do not cross the invisible line between service and presence. But rules were built for comfort, not for moments like this. She set her tray down on the nearest service station with quiet precision, the soft clink of glass barely noticeable beneath the cries. Then she stepped forward. Not rushed, not hesitant, intentional. Each step measured, steady, as she moved through the tension that seemed to thicken the air. A man near the table glanced at her, his expression flickering with mild irritation, as if she was about to make things worse simply by getting involved. Amara stopped just a few feet from Richard, close enough to see the strain in his jaw, the way his shoulders had tightened under the weight of eyes he was not used to feeling. For a brief moment, she said nothing. She just observed one last detail. Theo's breathing. Too quick, too shallow, Then she spoke, her voice calm, even, cutting through the noise without raising itself. "Sir, may I try?" The question hung there, simple, almost too simple for the moment it entered. Richard looked up, clearly not expecting her to be the one to speak. His eyes flicked to her uniform first, then to her face, searching for something, perhaps a reason to say no, perhaps a reason to hold on to control. Around them, the room leaned in without moving. He hesitated, just for a second. It was a small pause, but in that pause lived everything he had built his life on. Authority, distance, certainty, and all of it was failing him right now. Theo cried again, louder this time, his tiny hand clutching at Richard's collar. The sound broke whatever resistance was left. Richard swallowed, then gave a short, almost reluctant nod. It was not trust. Not yet. Just surrender to the fact that nothing else had worked. Amara stepped closer, her movements unhurried, her presence steady in a way that did not compete with the chaos but seemed to move around it. She reached out, not immediately taking the baby, but letting her hand hover for a fraction of a second, allowing Theo to register something different. A shift, a pause. Then gently, carefully, she took him into her arms. The transition was seamless, almost invisible, but the room felt it. The shift of control, the shift of energy. And for the first time since the crying began, something changed, not in the sound, not yet, but in the space between it, like the moment before a storm decides whether it will break or pass. Theo's cries did not stop immediately, but they changed, and that difference was everything. The sharp edge in his voice softened just slightly, like a note falling out of tune and searching for balance again. Amara did not rush to silence him. She did not bounce him the way Richard had, did not try to override the noise with motion or distraction. Instead, she adjusted her hold with quiet precision, one hand supporting his back, the other resting gently over his small chest, feeling the rhythm beneath her palm. Too fast. Still too fast. Her eyes flicked down for a fraction of a second, tracking his breathing, then back up, steady and calm, as if the rest of the room no longer existed. Around them, the air shifted. Conversations had not resumed, not really. People pretended to look away, but their attention lingered, drawn to the smallest movements, the slightest change in sound. Richard sat frozen, his hands now empty, fingers still slightly curved as if they had not yet realized they were no longer holding his son. He watched her, confusion and something quieter beneath it, something he did not name. Amara leaned in just slightly, her voice low, barely above a whisper, not meant for the room, only for the child in her arms. "Hey there, it is okay. I have you." The words were simple, but her tone carried something else, something measured and slow, like she was matching a rhythm Theo could follow. She shifted her stance, grounding her feet, then began to breathe, not dramatically, not exaggerated, just steady, intentional. Inhale, slow, controlled. Exhale, even slower. And as she did, her hand over Theo's chest remained still, offering a quiet, consistent pressure, a signal more than emotion. For a moment, nothing happened. Then another. Then something almost invisible. Theo's next breath did not come as sharply. It lingered just a fraction longer. His tiny fingers, still clenched before, loosened slightly against the fabric of her uniform. The cries came again, but softer now, less like panic and more like confusion fading into awareness. Amara did not change her pace. She did not celebrate the shift. She stayed with it, breath by breath, matching him, guiding without forcing. The room felt it before they understood it. The tension that had filled every corner began to loosen, thread by thread, like a knot slowly giving way. A woman near the window lowered her glass without realizing it. The man at the bar stopped checking his watch. Even the pianist, who had hesitated earlier, let his fingers hover above the keys, waiting, as if he knew something important was unfolding in the quiet. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Theo, watching every movement, as if seeing his own child for the first time. He noticed the small things now. The way Theo's shoulders were no longer rigid. The way his breaths, though still uneven, were beginning to find space between them. The way Amara did not try to take control, but instead created it without effort. Then, almost impossibly, Theo's cry broke mid-sound. Not cut off, not forced into silence. It simply stopped. His mouth remained open for a second, as if he had forgotten what he was doing. Then it closed. A soft, uneven inhale followed. Then another. The silence that replaced the noise was not empty. It was full of disbelief, full of something no one in that room could buy, no matter how much they were worth. Amara did not look up. She kept her focus where it belonged, her hands still steady, her breathing still calm, as if the moment was not extraordinary, as if this was simply what needed to happen. And in that silence, the balance of the room shifted completely, not with force, not with power, but with something far quieter and far more undeniable. No one spoke at first because no one wanted to be the one to break what had just happened. The silence held the room in place, delicate and almost sacred, like something that could disappear if touched too quickly. Theo rested against Amara's shoulder now, his small body no longer rigid but loose, his breathing uneven but calm, each inhale deeper than the last. His fingers, once clenched tight, now curled softly into the fabric of her sleeve, as if he had found something steady to hold on to. Amara adjusted her stance slightly, shifting her weight to keep him comfortable, her movements quiet and unforced, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. Across from her, Richard did not move. His gaze remained fixed, not on the room, not on the people who had been watching him just minutes ago, but on his son. There was something different in his expression now, something stripped of performance, stripped of control. He noticed details he had missed before. The warmth of Theo's cheek resting against Amara's shoulder. The way her hand remained gently in place, not gripping, not guiding, just present. The absence of urgency, the absence of force. It unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. A man near the table cleared his throat softly, as if reminding himself how sound worked again. The pianist, sensing the shift, resumed with a slow, careful melody, each note spaced with intention, respecting the quiet rather than filling it. Conversations began to return, but lower now, softer, like the entire room had recalibrated itself around a moment it could not fully explain. Amara finally lifted her eyes, meeting Richard's gaze for the first time since she had stepped in. There was no triumph there, no expectation, no need for acknowledgement. Just calm. "He is okay," she said gently, her voice steady, as if stating something simple, something obvious. Richard blinked once, as if the words took a second to reach him. He nodded slowly, but the motion felt different this time, less automatic, more intentional. What did you do?" he asked, his voice lower than before, stripped of the authority it usually carried. It was not a challenge. It was a question he did not have an answer for. Amara glanced down briefly at Theo, then back at Richard. "I listened," she replied. The answer landed quietly, but it carried weight. Not technical, not complicated, just true. Richard exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders dropping slightly as the tension left them. Around him, the room had moved on, at least on the surface, but something had shifted beneath it. The way a few guests now looked toward Amara with curiosity instead of dismissal. The way the manager, standing near the edge of the floor, hesitated before stepping in, unsure whether to interrupt what had already resolved itself. Amara gently guided Theo back toward his father, her movements just as careful as before, ensuring the transition did not break the calm she had created. Richard reached out, slower this time, more aware, his hands no longer trying to control but to receive. Theo settled into his arms without protest, a small sound escaping him, not a cry, just a soft, sleepy exhale. Richard looked down at him, then back up at Amara, something unspoken passing through his expression, something he was not used to offering. Respect, perhaps, or recognition, not of status, not of role, but of something deeper, something that had just rewritten the balance of the room without raising its voice. Richard did not return to his conversation, not immediately. The deal, the numbers, the carefully arranged meeting that had filled his calendar for weeks now sat untouched in front of him, reduced to something distant, almost irrelevant. He adjusted Theo, slightly in his arms, slower this time, more aware of how the child responded, watching for the small cues he had ignored before. Theo stirred, but did not cry. His breathing remained steady, uneven in the way of a baby drifting between alertness and sleep, his tiny hand gripping lightly against Richard's jacket as if testing whether the calm would hold. Richard's fingers hovered for a moment before gently resting against his son's back, not pressing, not directing, just there. Across the table, one of the investors cleared his throat, attempting to reset the rhythm of the evening. "Shall we continue?" he asked politely, though his eyes flickered once toward Amara, who had already stepped back into her role, lifting her tray again as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. The contrast was almost disorienting. Moments ago, she had been the center of something no one could explain. Now, she moved between tables once more, quiet, precise, nearly invisible again. But not to Richard. Not anymore. He glanced down at the documents in front of him, the numbers that usually commanded his full attention, and for the first time, they felt secondary. He looked back up, scanning the room until he found her again, moving with the same calm presence, speaking softly to another guest, her expression unchanged, her pace unhurried. It unsettled him in a way he could not quite define. Not because she had done something impressive, but because she had done something essential, something he had failed to do himself. The conversation at the table resumed, but Richard's responses came slower, less automatic. He answered when spoken to, nodded when appropriate, but his focus drifted, pulled back again and again to the moment he had just witnessed. Not the silence itself, but how it had been created. No force, no urgency, just understanding. After several minutes, he made a decision that would have felt insignificant on any other night, but here, now, it carried weight. He placed his pen down. "Excuse me," he said quietly, already rising from his seat before anyone could respond. A few heads turned, confusion flickering across their faces as they watched a man known for control step away from the very deal he had come to secure. Richard adjusted Theo once more, ensuring the baby remained settled, then moved through the restaurant with measured steps, not with the urgency of a businessman, but with the intention of someone seeking something he did not yet fully understand. He found her near the service station, setting down a tray, her movements as composed as ever. For a brief moment, he hesitated again, but this time it was not about control. It was about approach. "Amara," he said, reading her name from the small tag pinned neatly to her uniform. She turned, meeting his gaze without surprise, without tension, simply present. "Yes, sir," she replied. The word "sir" sounded different now, not submissive, not distant, just part of the exchange. Richard paused, searching for language that felt unfamiliar on his tongue. "How did you know?" he asked. That something was wrong. Amara glanced briefly at Theo, then back at Richard, her expression steady. "Because he was trying to tell you," she said simply. Richard frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in realization. "I was trying to calm him," he said, almost defensively, though the edge was gone from his voice. "You were trying to stop the noise," she replied gently. "He needed you to understand it." The distinction settled between them, quiet but undeniable. Richard looked down at Theo again, replaying the moment in his mind, the movements, the tension, the way he had reacted without truly seeing. For a man who had built an empire on reading situations faster than anyone else, the realization was sharp. He had missed something obvious. Not because it was hidden, but because he had never been taught to look for it. When he looked back up, there was something different in his expression now. Not just respect, something closer to humility. And in a room built on power, that shift carried more weight than anything money could measure. Richard did not respond right away, not because he disagreed, but because the truth in her words did not fit neatly into the way he understood the world. He had built his life on solutions, on speed, on outcomes measured in numbers and timelines. But this required something slower, something he had never prioritized. He looked down at Theo again, studying him with a different kind of attention now, not scanning for problems to fix, but for signals to understand. Theo shifted slightly, letting out a soft breath, his face relaxed in a way Richard had not seen before, and for a moment, everything else in the room faded. The deals, the expectations, the image he maintained so carefully, all of it felt distant compared to the small weight in his arms. "I did not see it," Richard admitted quietly, more to himself than to Amara, though she heard it. The admission sat between them, simple but heavy, a crack in the certainty he carried everywhere else. Amara did not react with surprise or judgment. She had seen that moment before too, the point where someone realized they had been listening to respond, not to understand. Most people do not. she said gently, her tone neither critical nor comforting, just honest. It takes practice. Richard let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, only recognition. Practice. It was a word he respected, a word that built companies and careers, yet somehow he had never applied it here. Around them, the restaurant continued to move, servers passing by, soft conversations returning, the world resetting itself as if nothing had shifted, but Richard knew better. He felt it in the way he held Theo now, more carefully, more present. "Where did you learn that?" he asked after a moment, his voice steadier, but still carrying that unfamiliar edge of curiosity. Amara glanced toward the far end of the room for a second, as if the answer existed somewhere beyond the walls. "I used to volunteer at a children's center," she said. "A lot of kids who could not explain what they felt. You learn to pay attention to what they cannot say." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that, connecting it to what he had just witnessed, the calm, the patience, the absence of control. It was not luck. It was not instinct alone. It was experience shaped by something he had never taken the time to understand. He shifted Theo again, more naturally now, adjusting to the small movements instead of resisting them, and Theo responded, settling even deeper into his arms. Richard noticed that too. Everything felt different now, not because the situation had changed, but because he had. And as he looked back at Amara, standing there in a simple uniform, no title, no power in the way he defined it, he understood something that no boardroom had ever taught him. The most valuable skills in the room were not always the ones people applauded. Sometimes, they were the ones no one noticed until they were the only thing that worked. Richard did not return to the table right away, even though he knew every minute mattered in a room like this. Deals did not wait. People like him did not step away without consequence. But for once, consequence did not feel like something measured in dollars. It felt quieter than that. He glanced over his shoulder toward the table where executives sat pretending to resume normal conversation, their voices slightly off rhythm, their attention still drifting back to where he stood. He had spent years mastering how to control a room like that, how to guide attention, how to dominate outcomes. And yet, a few minutes ago, he had lost all of it to something as small and as powerful as a child's cry. He looked back at Amara. "Do you ever get used to it?" he asked, the question coming out more personal than he intended. Amara tilted her head slightly, considering. "The noise?" she asked. Richard nodded once. She gave a small, almost thoughtful smile. "No," she said. "You just learn not to fight it." The answer settled deeper than he expected. Not to fight it. Richard had built everything by fighting. Competition, pressure, failure. He met every challenge head-on, faster, harder, louder than anyone else in the room. But here, that instinct had failed him completely. Theo shifted again, letting out a soft sound, not distress, just movement, and Richard instinctively adjusted, slower now, matching the rhythm he had seen Amara use earlier. Theo settled almost immediately. Richard noticed that too, not as a coincidence. As a response. For the first time, he was not reacting. He was paying attention. A manager approached carefully from the side, his posture polite but uncertain. "Sir, your table is ready when you are," he said, his voice low, as if he did not want to disrupt whatever had just taken place. Richard nodded, but did not move yet. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, then stopped. The motion felt automatic, transactional, something from the version of himself that solved everything with numbers. He let his hand fall back to his side. This was not that kind of moment. He looked at Amara again, more directly this time. "You changed something tonight," he said, his voice steady, not exaggerated, just clear. Amara did not react the way most people would have. No surprise, no gratitude, just a quiet shake of her head. "He did," she replied, nodding gently toward Theo. "I just helped him be heard." Richard followed her gaze, looking down at his son, then back up again. The distinction mattered. It shifted the credit. It shifted the understanding. It shifted him. Around them, the restaurant continued its slow return to normal, but the balance had already changed. Not in the lighting or the music or the conversations, but in the way one man now stood in the middle of it all, no longer trying to own the room, but finally beginning to understand it. And for the first time that night, Richard Langston did not feel like the most powerful person there. He felt like a father learning something he should have known all along. Richard finally turned back toward the table, But his steps were different now, slower, measured not by urgency, but by awareness. Each movement carried intention, not performance. Theo rested quietly against his chest, his small breath steady. His presence no longer a disruption, but a rhythm Richard had begun to follow. As he approached, the conversation at the table adjusted, voices lowering slightly, eyes lifting with polite curiosity masked as professionalism. One of the investors leaned forward with a practiced smile. "Everything all right?" he asked, the question casual on the surface but edged with expectation. Richard paused for half a second, then nodded. "Yes," he said simply, his voice calm, without the usual sharpness that often accompanied his authority. He took his seat again, but he did not immediately reach for the documents. Instead, he adjusted Theo gently, ensuring the baby remained comfortable, his attention still divided in a way it had never been before. Across the table, a few exchanged glances, subtle but noticeable. They were waiting for him to resume control, to reestablish the tempo, to bring the conversation back to numbers and projections and outcomes that could be measured and negotiated. Richard knew the rhythm well. He had created it countless times. But tonight, something inside that rhythm had shifted. He picked up the pen in front of him, rolling it lightly between his fingers, then set it back down again. The motion was small, but it did not go unnoticed. "Before we continue," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before, "I would like to adjust something." The room stilled, attention focusing more directly now. This was the moment they understood. Something had changed. Richard glanced briefly toward the far side of the restaurant, where Amara moved once again between tables, her presence blending back into the environment that had overlooked her just minutes ago. Then he looked back at the people in front of him. "We spend a lot of time talking about control," he continued, his tone even, not dramatic, but deliberate. "Market control, operational control, risk control." A few nodded, following his words, expecting a strategic pivot. "But control is not always the answer," he added. That landed differently, subtly, but clearly. One of the investors shifted in his seat, not uncomfortable, but uncertain where this was going. Richard rested his hand lightly against Theo's back, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm, grounding himself in something real before continuing. "Sometimes," he said, "you do not need to control the situation. You need to understand it." Silence followed. Not awkward, not tense, just present. The kind of silence that invites reflection rather than reaction. Richard let it sit there for a moment, not rushing to fill it the way he might have before. Across the table, the same investor who had spoken earlier leaned back slightly, studying Richard with a new kind of attention. "And how does that change the deal?" he asked, his voice measured, curious rather than challenging. Richard allowed himself a small pause, considering the question, but also recognizing what it represented. "The old framework, the old lens. It changes how we approach it," he replied. "Less pressure, more alignment. We are not here to force an outcome. We are here to build one that actually works." The words were simple, but the shift behind them was not. It moved the conversation away from dominance and toward understanding, away from speed and toward precision of a different kind. Around the table, the energy adjusted again, this time not from disruption, but from direction. And as the discussion slowly resumed, something unexpected happened. The tone softened. The interruptions lessened. The need to assert dominance faded just slightly, replaced by something more measured, more thoughtful. Richard noticed it, but he did not point it out. He did not need to. He felt it in the pacing of the conversation, in the way people listened a fraction longer before speaking. And in that subtle shift, he recognized something deeper than any negotiation tactic he had mastered. The same principle that had calmed his son was now shaping the room. Not control, not force, understanding. And for the first time in a setting built on power, that approach was not a weakness. It was the strongest position in the room. The meeting did not end with applause, and it did not need to. It ended with something quieter, something more lasting. Pens moved across paper, agreements were marked, not rushed, not forced, but understood. One by one, the investors leaned back in their chairs, their expressions no longer guarded, their posture no longer defensive. The deal was done, but it felt different from the ones Richard had closed before. There was no sharp victory in his chest, no rush of dominance. Instead, there was a calm certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself. Richard signed the final page, then set the pen down with a soft click. For a moment, he did not stand. He looked at Theo, still resting peacefully against him, his small hand now completely relaxed, his breathing deep and steady, untouched by the tension that had once filled the room. Richard's thumb moved slightly, a small, absent gesture of comfort, but this time it was not instinct alone. It was awareness. Around him, chairs shifted, polite farewells began, hands were shaken, but Richard's attention drifted once more, pulled back to the place where everything had changed. Amara was there again, near the edge of the room, collecting empty glasses, her movements as composed as they had been at the beginning of the night. No spotlight, no acknowledgement from the crowd, just quiet work. Richard stood this time, adjusting Theo carefully before making his way toward her once more. There was no hesitation now, no uncertainty in his steps. When he reached her, she looked up, meeting his gaze with the same calm presence. "Thank you," he said, and this time the words carried weight. Not transactional, not automatic, real. Amara gave a small nod, accepting the words without making them larger than they needed to be. "He did the rest," she replied softly, glancing at Theo. Richard followed her gaze, then looked back at her, understanding the meaning behind it more clearly now. He reached into his pocket again, but paused, remembering. Slowly, he let his hand fall away. Instead, he offered something he rarely gave. "I will remember this," he said. Amara held his gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once. "That is enough," she said. And it was. Richard turned to leave, moving through the restaurant one last time, but the space felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The noise, the light, the quiet conversations, all of it remained the same, yet it no longer defined the room the way it had before. As he stepped out into the night air, cool and steady, Theo stirred slightly, then settled again against him. Richard looked down, a small, almost unnoticeable smile forming at the edge of his expression. He had walked into the evening as a man who owned everything in the room. He walked out understanding something far more valuable. Some things cannot be controlled, only understood. And sometimes, the most powerful voice is the one you almost ignored.